Hello and welcome to my series on the top 10 games of the 2010s. We start here with game number 10 between Alireza Firouzja and Mila Zarkovic. Now, Alireza Firouzja is already at age 16 one of the biggest names in chess as we close out this decade. He literally today, as I record this, just finished second in the World Rapid Chess Championship, and he also just made big waves by abandoning his Iranian Chess Federation. Now, in the 2020s, I think everyone is expecting many more brilliant games from him, but possibly his first immortal chess game is this game right here. Alireza opens up the game with pawn to e4 and his opponent responds with the Sicilian defense. We get into original territory quite quickly here after the move 3a6 and then 4g3 from Alireza in response. Now, these are both interesting approaches from white and black. This g3 kind of setup against the Najdorf and against Scheveningen systems has become kind of trendy. It's really surprisingly poisonous with low risk for white, and also there's not a ton of theory to get into here, so this is becoming more popular and deservedly so. Also, after this game, I think that lots of people will be inspired to try it and try to imitate what Alireza achieves in this game. Now, after pawn to b5 from black is really committing to a queenside expansion, and I think black gets into a lot of trouble as a result. Obviously, in a lot of Sicilians, an early queenside expansion makes sense, but here, Alireza is going to castle on the king side, and because he's not committing his king to the queen side, I think that there's not much of a target or good source for counterplay as black expands on the queen side. The queen side is going to become overextended, and also black is going to be underdeveloped and struggling to castle in the game. So all of that really gets out of hand very, very quickly for black. Even though this isn't a huge mistake yet, I think it's philosophically a problem that black is dealing with, where inaccuracies keep coming because of this desire to play on the queen side. So now we get pawn to d4, opening up the Sicilian right here, and that recaptures on d4 with the knight here, bishop to b7, bishop to g2, knight f6. Watch out for these ideas with e5. They're not there yet, but they could be really soon. We get castles, pawn to e6, rook to e1, adding juice to the idea of e5. For example, if bishop e7, developing and getting ready to castle, you get hit by e5 because when you capture on g2, your bishop on e7 that you just developed is hanging and you're losing material on the spot. So this is a big sign of the kind of problems that black is dealing with already. After rook e1, probably best was just developing this knight, which keeps control over e5. But in the game, Zarkovic decided to try knight f to d7 instead. Kind of an interesting move. It resolves the problem of pawn to e5 a little more permanently in that e5 is not going to attack f6, but there's still e5 tactics in the position. They're just a little different. And still, how are you going to get this knight out? Of course, it's time to increase the pressure and tempo and make legitimate threats. Pawn to a4 comes, cracking the queenside, perfect timing. We get captures and the rook captures. This rook has a ton of potential over here. It can swing over all the way across the fourth rank in some cases. There's a lot of ideas with the rook. So after rook takes a4, we get bishop e7, developing and getting ready to castle. And here, rook b4 was played. We'll look at that in a moment. It's great. But another line I want to point out is something pointed out by the computer. There is pawn to e5 here. Whoops. Pawn to e5. And after pawn e5, if you played d5 to try and close off the diagonal, which makes sense because you were attacked on d6 and b7, then you have the amazing move bishop to h6. Just absolutely stunning. Now, if you don't capture the bishop, there are threats here and queen g4 and other things are coming, so the attack is huge. But if you do capture the bishop, then I have knight to e6. And this leads to a tremendous and winning attack for white. It's completely overwhelming. If you capture my knight, I just introduce my queen and my rook, and I just crush you. It is really a beautiful attack. I love this bishop h6 and knight takes e6 combination. Great, great stuff. So in the game, what happened was rook b4 instead of pawn e5. This is also really strong. And because of the attack on b7, Zarkovic tried knight to c5 in this position. Alireza now strikes with a move that reminds me a lot of the really brilliant game Kasparov-Shira from the 1990s. We get rook takes b7, just an absolute hammer blow right here. The rook sacrifices itself for a really valuable bishop, and when the knight retakes, this bishop becomes a monster unleashed immediately by pawn to e5, and the knight on b7 is just terribly placed. Just yesterday, Yasser Seirawan was talking about the worst place for a knight being like b7, b2, g2, and g7, a Fianchettoed square. That's absolutely the case here. This knight is hobbled and pinned, and white's pressure on the long diagonal is just tremendous after this rook takes b7 sacrifice. Now, if you just try to defend passively with queen to c7 right here, then taking on d6 is really strong because you got to keep defending b7. You have to take back with the bishop. And then one of many crushing moves is knight takes e6 here. When the pawn captures back, you have rook takes e6 check. If you want to defend both of these, then you have to pull your king up to d7, and then bishop h3 is one of many winning moves. Even though you're up a ton of material here as black, it doesn't matter. There's just no way to avoid catastrophic material loss and pretty much checkmate in this position. It's a huge, huge attack for Alireza. So after e5, as a result, black naturally tries to close the position down with pawn to d5. For a moment, it might seem like Zarkovic is safe, but after pawn to d5, we have another sacrifice here. We get knight takes d5. This is a really, really brilliant move to me. After pawn takes d5 here, if we count material for a moment, Alireza is down a rook, and he's not really got a clear and immediate follow-up, in my opinion. You don't have, some coming checkmate right away. Instead, your pieces are just amazing, and you're just leveraging so much pressure that black cannot defend. I find this position super instructive because even having seen this game, I'd struggle to think that I might play a similar knight sacrifice. In any case, after knight takes d5, Zarkovic does capture on d5. Maybe better was just castling, but after knight f4, all of white's pieces are humming. There's still all this pressure right here. It's actually a really strong position, but this is the most resilient option available to black. Instead, after pawn takes d5, we get knight to f5 here. Now, the threats for Alireza include knight takes g7, kind of the obvious one, but also just bishop takes d5 when the bishop is tremendous and there's pressure in both directions, and then pawn to e6 and even queen g4 are other threats in the position. For example, if pawn to g6 here, which makes a lot of sense, knight check, the king comes over because otherwise queen takes d5 if the king tries to run to d7. So now bishop h6 threatening huge discoveries, king g8 trying to get out of the way of those discoveries. And now here you have bishop takes d5. There's pressure here. There's ideas of queen f3. E6 is probably the biggest threat, of course. Even bishop takes f7 is in many cases a winning threat. All of this means that this position is completely overwhelming. I encourage you to look at it and try and find a defense. There isn't one, and then try to find the refutations of the defenses you do try. So in any case, after knight f5, black does go ahead and castle here, sticking the king behind the g7 pawn and hoping that the position coheres and he can resist. Now, after castles, we get bishop takes d5. Again, pressure in both directions, really huge. It's hard to hold this knight on b7. If you try queen c7, which is really the only sensible way to try to defend both the knight and the bishop on e7, a winning idea here is pawn to e6. And if you try to keep this closed with pawn to f6, then bishop f4 is the idea. This was pretty much the response to anything, including f6 on the last move. And there's just no way after attacking the queen that black can defend b7 and e7 together, so white is just winning material and the game. As a result, after bishop takes d5, Zarkovic tried bishop to c5, hoping that after a capture of the knight on b7, he could trade queens and then the position's still bad, but maybe he's not losing a brilliancy. After bishop c5, Alireza again finds the best move, pawn to b4. This obviously puts the bishop under attack and it disrupts black's coordination. If the bishop captures on b4, then it's hanging over here and queen g4 comes. To be honest though, even though we are winning this bishop in many lines, we probably aren't even going to take it because the attack is so strong. There's mate threatened on g7 right here, so the only response really is pawn to g6 and then knight h6 check, king up to g7, and then bishop g5 is a winning threat. You can capture the loose bishop on d5, but it doesn't matter because of check, and then mate here on the h file. Very, very nice stuff. As a result, after pawn to b4, the bishop falls back to b6. Another thing I love about the pawn being on b4, even though it really doesn't matter because we're winning tactically, is how bad it makes this knight on b7. That knight on b7 was already sad enough, but it is just completely dominated in this position. And the fact that white is down a rook just doesn't really matter at all. Also, I'll mention that b4 opened up the diagonal for this bishop to sometimes reach b2, which can be huge. Now queen g4 comes. Again, there's that mate threat here on g7. So as a result, we get pawn to g6, the only way to respond to that mate threat. And now we get a strike from Alireza. He plays pawn to e6, just tearing open the position. The end is near for Zarkovic. Let's look at how we can respond after pawn to e6. So first off, we're threatening pawn to e7 and pawn takes f7 here. Both are huge threats. If you try to capture that pawn here on e6, then I'm going to capture back with the rook. That leaves this bishop hanging, but it doesn't really matter because if you capture the bishop, well, I do have a royal fork here, but I don't even need it because I'm going to play rook takes on g6 check. And of course, if you capture, then I have a simple mate here on g7. And even if you don't capture here on g6, after rook takes g6 check, if you run over here, then I have a mating attack with rook g7 check and further checks tearing open the king here. And if you try to hide right away, after rook takes g6, king h8, well, that b4 move comes back again, and I now have access to this diagonal, bishop b2 check, and again, I'm checkmating in a very, very, very nice way. So otherwise, after pawn to e6, we can also mention knight to c6, trying to finally develop that knight on b8. And here, a good way to finish is pawn takes f7, and then after rook takes, bishop takes. If the king captures back, we might look at the position for a moment and go, where's the finish? But then we see queen to c4 check, and this is actually just going to be checkmate. If the king falls back, we have bishop to h6. Beautiful, beautiful checkmate. It's wonderful how white's pieces dominate the board. So after e6, what was actually tried was queen to f6 in this position. Now e7 came, the rook moved to e8, getting out of the way of the attack of that pawn on e7, of course. And now another excellent finishing move and the best move in the position. Bishop takes f7 check, and this is where Zarkovic resigned. Why did he resign in this position? Well, it's not too hard to see that queen takes runs into knight h6 check, a lovely royal fork to finish things off. But also after bishop takes f7, if you try to take with the king, then we see again this queen c4 check move. Beautiful stuff. And in this position, there's nothing but queen blocks and then queen takes, and it's checkmate on the board. I hope that you enjoyed this game as much as I did. If you did, of course, check out the playlist that's sitting on top of the board with other great games, and especially check out the playlist with the top 10 games of the 2010s, of which this is number 10 in my book. I'll see you again, hopefully, for another game in this series.